Canada is fighting back against Trump's fentanyl blame game, and the meeting that just happened in Washington could change everything. While Trump has been using fentanyl as his go-to justification for crushing tariffs on Canada, something significant is unfolding in Washington.
There could be some movement on the Canada-U.S. trade front. The cabinet minister leading those talks, Dominic LeBlanc, is in Washington and met this morning with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. The CBC's Ashley Burke joins us now from the U.S. Capitol. What can you tell us, Ashley?
JP, a Canadian source tells me that there is a sense of urgency right now, that the Canadian side sees a window to try and land a trade deal with the U.S. But the source also says that there are no guarantees that it will happen in the next few weeks. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is here right now in Washington. He met with Donald Trump's Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, this morning and posted a photo online calling it a productive meeting. LeBlanc's office says it lasted about 90 minutes, and it's all part of Canada's efforts to try and get the Trump administration to drop or at least lower a series of tariffs hitting Canadian sectors hard. Here's what the Prime Minister said today.
Aluminum, steel, autos, copper. They happen to have a specific on copper, and then, of course, lumber, softwood lumber, which has been an issue. So those are the areas where immediately we are focused on improving the outcomes. In order to do that, we will have to look at other areas where we can have win-win cooperation, other areas.
Today's meeting here in Washington comes after the Prime Minister announced last week that he would drop some retaliatory tariffs.
High-level Canadian officials just sat down with U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi to set the record straight. What happened behind those closed doors reveals a strategic shift that could completely flip the script on this trade war. Justice Minister Sean Fraser, Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasangari, and Canada's fentanyl czar Kevin Brosseau held what they called a productive first meeting with U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi in Washington on Wednesday afternoon. This wasn't just another diplomatic courtesy call. This was Canada taking the offensive in a battle that's been raging since Trump returned to office. The 45-minute meeting was described as warm and cordial, but don't let the pleasantries fool you. This was strategic diplomacy at its finest. The Canadian officials didn't just exchange business cards, they exchanged personal phone numbers with Bondi and agreed to stay in close contact. That's not standard protocol. That's the kind of direct line you establish when you're planning to work together on something big. So what exactly did they discuss? The focus was border security and criminal justice reforms that Canada is planning to introduce this fall. We're talking bail reform, sentencing changes, and legislation to address gender-based violence. But more importantly, this was Canada's opportunity to highlight its efforts to keep communities safe from fentanyl and transnational criminal organizations on both sides of the border. Here's where it gets interesting. Trump has been hammering Canada with his fentanyl narrative for months. He's imposed a crushing 35% tariff on Canadian goods, claiming Canada isn't doing enough to stop the flow of deadly drugs into the United States. But the facts tell a very different story, one that Canada is now making sure U.S. officials understand. Trump's entire tariff strategy has been built on what he calls a national emergency caused by fentanyl flowing across the northern border. He's claimed that Canada has failed to cooperate in curbing the ongoing flood of fentanyl and other illicit drugs. In July, he even increased tariffs from 25% to 35%. Saying Canada's continued inaction and retaliation made it necessary to effectively address the emergency. But here's what Trump doesn't want you to know. Canada plays almost no role in America's fentanyl crisis. During remarks in March, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said smuggling from Canada contributes less than 1% of the fentanyl street supply in the U.S., and the data backs him up. In 2024, only about 43 pounds of fentanyl was seized at America's northern border. Compare that with roughly 21,100 pounds seized at the southern border with Mexico. That's a ratio of nearly 500 to 1. The numbers are so stark, it's almost embarrassing for Trump's narrative. While 97% of fentanyl seizures occur at the U.S.-Mexico border, Trump continues to bash Canada as if it's the primary source of America's drug problem. Canadian officials have repeatedly pointed out that fentanyl seizures at the northern border have dropped to near zero levels. Canada is spending $1.3 billion on new security measures along the border, deploying helicopters, drones, surveillance tools, scanners, and sniffer dog teams specifically to stop fentanyl. But Trump's fentanyl justification faces an even bigger problem. The crisis is actually improving dramatically. Fatal overdoses from fentanyl and all other street drugs have plummeted nationally by more than 21% since June 2023, falling below 90,000 deaths in a 12-month period for the first time in roughly half a decade. Fentanyl deaths specifically have dropped by over 30% in 1 year. Many states have seen declines in fatal overdoses of between 30 and 50%. So why is Trump still pushing this narrative? Because it's never really been about fentanyl. It's about leverage. Trump has repeatedly promised to charge Canada a 25% tariff on all products coming into the United States, saying this tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country. But with fentanyl deaths dropping and Canada contributing less than 1% of the problem, that justification is falling apart. That's where this Washington meeting becomes crucial. Canada isn't just defending itself anymore. It's going on the offensive by sending 3 high-level officials, including their dedicated fentanyl czar, to meet directly with the U.S. Attorney General. Canada is making a statement. They're saying, you want to talk about fentanyl? Let's talk about fentanyl. Here are the facts. Here's what we're doing, and here's why your tariffs are completely unjustified. The timing of this meeting is also significant. It comes just 1 day after Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc had what was described as a constructive and lengthy meeting with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. That meeting was supposed to last an hour, but went for 90 minutes, with Canadian sources describing a sense of optimism following the discussion. This represents a coordinated Canadian strategy. While LeBlanc handles the trade discussions, Fraser, Anandasangari, and Brosseau are tackling the fentanyl narrative head-on. They're separating the trade talks from the drug policy discussions, forcing U.S. officials to confront the reality that these two issues have been artificially linked for political purposes. The Canadian delegation also offered their condolences over a shooting at a Minnesota church that left 3 dead and 17 people injured. This wasn't just diplomatic courtesy. It was a subtle reminder of where America's real violence problems lie. While Trump focuses on a largely imaginary fentanyl threat from Canada, Americans are dying from gun violence that has nothing to do with border security. What makes this meeting even more significant is who initiated it. According to sources, it was the U.S. Department of Justice that reached out to Canadian officials to schedule the talks. That suggests the Americans are starting to recognize that the fentanyl justification for tariffs doesn't hold water. When your own Justice Department is reaching out to foreign officials to discuss the very issue you've been using to justify trade wars, that's a sign your narrative is in trouble. The fact that this meeting was described as not directly related to Canada-U.S. trade talks is also telling. Canada is successfully compartmentalizing these issues, forcing U.S. officials to deal with the fentanyl question on its own merits, rather than as a trade negotiation tactic. But Canada's strategy goes deeper than just meetings and phone calls. The country has appointed Kevin Brosseau as its dedicated fentanyl czar, a position created specifically to coordinate Canada's response to the opioid crisis. By bringing Brosseau to this meeting, Canada is demonstrating that it takes the fentanyl issue seriously, more seriously, arguably, than the Trump administration, which has been using it primarily as a political weapon. Canada is also preparing comprehensive criminal justice reforms for this fall, including bail reform, sentencing changes, and legislation to address gender-based violence. These aren't token gestures, they're substantial policy changes that demonstrate Canada's commitment to public safety and criminal justice cooperation with the United States. The warm tone of the meeting and the exchange of personal contact information suggests that U.S. officials are beginning to see Canada as a partner rather than an adversary in addressing cross-border crime. That's a fundamental shift from the confrontational approach that has characterized Trump's tariff strategy. Meanwhile, Trump's broader tariff strategy is facing challenges on multiple fronts. The economic impact is becoming impossible to ignore.
After a phone call with U.S. President Donald Trump Thursday, the Prime Minister is now trying to sell Canadians on the idea that no new deal with the United States is the best trade deal in the world.
We're matching what the United States has done, what the President has done. We have the best deal of any country with the United States right now.
As of September 1st, Canada will drop counter tariffs on U.S. goods covered by CUSMA. Those have been an irritant for Trump, and the Prime Minister indicated that in their Thursday phone call, Trump said getting rid of them would kickstart negotiations, which Carney described as intensifying. In the Oval Office, the president said he now wants to be very good.
Canada has implemented retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods. Mexico has responded with its own 25% tariffs on U.S. products. China has slapped additional tariffs of 10 to 15% on U.S. agricultural imports. The very countries Trump claims aren't cooperating on fentanyl are now actively retaliating against his trade policies. Leading economists warn that the tariffs could destabilize global markets, disrupt trade, and ultimately increase costs for U.S. businesses and consumers. Americans are already paying more for groceries, gas, and cars because of these tariffs. The policy that was supposed to protect Americans is actually hurting them. Sometimes in negotiations, you need to know when to shift your strategy.
And there is a time in a game, in a big game, and this is a big game, when you go hard in the corners, your elbows up. The time in a game where you drop the gloves in the first period and you send a message. And we've done that pretty uniquely in the world. We happen to have the best deal with the Americans right now, I'd note. But there's also a time in a game where you want the puck, you want a stick handle, you want to pass, you want to put the puck in the net. And we're moving later into the game, and we're at that time of the game.
Just like in hockey, there's a time to go hard in the corners with your elbows up and drop the gloves to send a message. But as talks progress, you need to move from confrontation to skillful maneuvering to stick handle, pass, and put the puck in the net. That's exactly what Canada appears to be doing now. Canada maintains significant leverage in these discussions.
I don't think Canada's given up very much. I think Canada has ground to gain, and I think Canada has the equity in the dialogue to do so, which includes an awful lot of goods and products and services that the United States uses and needs. So I think Canada's in a pretty solid negotiating posture, but a negotiating posture doesn't do any good if you're not negotiating. So I think this effort by the Prime Minister to get back to the discussions is a good step.
And do you think there are other intangibles that might be being discussed in amongst, we were talking about steel and aluminum as being the big thing, but what about water and the fact that this border between Canada and the U.S. Saves the U.S. a ton of money? Do you think any of those things are being brought in?
I guess, well, I doubt that water's being discussed much. I don't quite understand your point.
The country provides goods, products, and services that the United States desperately needs. A negotiating posture doesn't do any good if you're not actually negotiating, and Canada has successfully restarted these crucial talks without giving up significant ground. Trump's fentanyl narrative is also undermined by his own administration's data. While he claims that fentanyl smuggling justifies tariffs against Canada, his own Customs and Border Protection data shows that fentanyl seizures at the U.S.-Mexico border have dropped by roughly 50% in recent months. If the policy is working, why continue the tariffs? The answer is that this was never really about fentanyl. It was about creating leverage in trade negotiations. But that strategy is backfiring. By using a public health crisis as a trade weapon, Trump has undermined both his credibility on drug policy and his effectiveness in trade negotiations. Canada's response has been masterful. Instead of getting drawn into a tit-for-tat trade war, they've focused on the underlying issues. They've demonstrated their commitment to border security, invested billions in new security measures, and created dedicated positions to coordinate their response to the opioid crisis. They've separated the legitimate policy discussions from the political theater. The meeting with Attorney General Bondi represents the culmination of this strategy. By engaging directly with U.S. law enforcement officials, Canada is bypassing the political rhetoric and focusing on practical cooperation. They're saying, if you really care about fentanyl, let's work together on solutions. If you just want to use it as an excuse for tariffs, we're going to expose that for what it is. This approach is already showing results. The fact that the Justice Department reached out to schedule this meeting suggests that serious U.S. officials recognize the need for genuine cooperation rather than political posturing. The warm tone of the meeting and the agreement to stay in close contact indicate that this cooperation is beginning to develop. The broader implications of Canada's strategy extend beyond trade policy. By demonstrating that small countries can effectively challenge superpower narratives through facts, diplomacy, and strategic communication, Canada is providing a model for other nations facing similar pressures. Trump's fentanyl justification for tariffs was always weak, but Canada's coordinated response has exposed just how weak it really is. When your own Justice Department is reaching out to the countries you're supposedly punishing for not cooperating, when the data shows those countries contribute less than 1% of the problem, and when the crisis you're claiming to address is actually improving dramatically, your entire narrative collapses. The meeting between Canadian officials and Attorney General Bondi may have lasted only 45 minutes, but it represents a fundamental shift in how this conflict is being framed. Canada has moved from defense to offense, from responding to Trump's accusations to setting the agenda for genuine cooperation. As these discussions continue, one thing is clear: Trump's fentanyl blame game is falling apart, and Canada's strategic response is changing the entire dynamic of this trade dispute. The question now is whether the Trump administration will abandon its failed narrative and engage in genuine problem solving, or double down on a strategy that's already backfiring. Based on this meeting, it looks like serious U.S. officials are ready for a different approach, one based on facts rather than fiction, cooperation rather than confrontation.